1843 Georgia. A plantation house stood gleaming, dressed for celebration. Carriages lined the gravel drive. White silk gowns shimmered in the glow of candlelight, and a wedding feast stretched across the hall, like wealth hammered into silver and carved into stone. Laughter rose with the music glasses, lifted high in ritual toasts. But beneath the polished floorboards in the suffocating heat of the kitchen, another preparation was underway. She was a wet nurse, her own child lowered months earlier into unmarked soil, her body now conscripted to nourish the master's infants. On this day, her hands stirred sugar into cakes, poured wine into crystal. Each gesture appeared obedient, every movement practiced. And yet, something had shifted. Within the sweetness, there was silence. And within that silence, there was revenge. When the feast began, the first bite was joy. The second, unease. By nightfall, vows gave way to convulsions, silk stained with blood, and a family legacy undone at its own table. The parish record would call it spoiled food. Local whispers called it something else, the hand of a woman erased from history, but not from memory. This is not simply the tale of a wedding gone wrong. It is a story of erasure of silence, wielded as defiance of one act that turned celebration into funeral. Where are you listening from tonight? Share it in the comments below. And if you're drawn to what lingers in the shadows, the hidden, the macabre, the forgotten, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Because here, history is never silent. In the late summer of 1843, the estate prepared for its most elaborate performance. The wedding was not merely a joining of two families, but a staged declaration of permanence and prosperity. The house itself became a stage set, shutters repainted in hurried strokes, windows polished to a gleam, floors waxed until they mirrored the chandeliers above. In the parlors, white silk draperies softened the corners, while flowers hauled in buckets from the fields were arranged with care, arranged by hands that would never be permitted to appear in the ceremony itself. Southern weddings in this era were less about intimacy than display. They were social accounting, proving to neighboring families that bloodlines held steady fortunes intact and property, human and otherwise sufficient to carry the inheritance forward. Guest lists were measured like ledgers, each name a record of standing. On this day, 30 carriages rolled down the gravel drive, each bearing lace perfume and expectation. Yet below this stage, true labor unfolded. The kitchen, built apart from the main house to contain heat and smoke, pulsed with motion from the earliest hours. Fires roared pots, rattled, smoke clung to rafters as hands moved with speed and precision. And there in the thick air, the wet nurse bent not over a cradle, but over a cutting board. Like so many women in her position, she was shifted from one exploitation to another, still tethered to the master's children, while pressed into service as cook. The children she fed slept upstairs beneath silk canopies, while her own lay beneath unmarked soil, remembered only in silence. Upstairs, the soundscape was another world entirely. Violin rehearsals drifted through open parlor doors, punctuated by the laughter of bridesmaids. The master of the house practiced his toast, each phrase crafted to praise lineage and prosperity. A seamstress made her final stitches to the bride's gown. All of it moved forward under the assumption that such opulence was natural, ordained, inevitable. The labor that made it possible was hidden, its silence enforced as carefully as the silverware laid out on the tables. Surveillance was constant. Overseers and mistresses of the house moved between rooms, their eyes not on the guests, but on the servants. Every gesture measured, speed posture, obedience. A pause might invite punishment. A glance too bold could threaten the fragile order the wedding rested upon. The wet nurse felt these eyes most of all, and still she carried her labor without hesitation. That was the expectation service, so seamless it disappeared, polished as glass. Southern weddings demanded abundance. Contemporary accounts list roasted meats, sugared fruits, towering cakes branded with family crests, and wines imported across the ocean. Each dish was a performance of wealth abundance made edible. But every plate, every goblet passed through hands never meant to be acknowledged. Enslaved men and women butchered the meat, sugared. The almonds washed the crystal until it caught the light without flaw. Above the floorboards, permanence was celebrated. Below them, exhaustion was consumed. The parlor glowed with music, laughter, and candlelight. The kitchen groaned with smoke-blackened walls, blistered skin, and the ceaseless rhythm of knives striking wood. Together, these spaces formed the architecture of a southern ceremony, opulence above toil below. Harmony in appearance, but underneath a dissonance no music could fully conceal. Even silence carried its own sound. Every celebration in the South was built on silence, and silence never stayed buried. In the plantation economy, the body of the black woman was never her own. It was resource, instrument, and currency. Nowhere was this more brutally revealed than in the practice of wet nursing. From Virginia to Georgia, enslaved women were forced to feed the children of their enslavers while their own infants withered on hurried weaning or starvation. Medical records would later sanitize this truth, describing it blandly as high infant mortality among the Negro population. But behind those sterile words lay deliberate design. Babies died so others might live. Not by accident, not by nature, by command. She had been chosen precisely for her body, strong, fertile, lactating. That was all the logic required. She was pulled from her own child's cradle to feed another. There was no explanation, no ceremony. Ownership needed none. Her breasts, heavy with milk, became the property of the household. The infants she nourished upstairs would sleep in polished nurseries, their cries muffled by silk blankets and foreign toys. Her own baby weakened lips, unable to draw from a body already emptied. And when at last her child was lowered into unmarked soil, the cycle was complete. No priest spoke over the grave. No headstone carried a name. For enslaved children, burial was not memory, it was erasure. Soil covered what the ledger refused to list. She returned to the house with arms, emptied breasts still full. Another infant wailed. She bent without protest to feed it. This was the expectation silence. Her roles blurred until they became indistinguishable. Weeks after her child's death, she was shifted into the kitchen. Her nursing duties carried on between stirring pots and scrubbing pans. At any moment, she might be summoned, cook, nurse, servant. Her body stretched across demands until grief itself had no room to exist. If she wept, it was unrecorded. If she faltered, correction was swift. Physicians of the period wrote of loaning black women's milk as though it were a commodity transferred on paper. Mistresses defended the practice as convenience, sparing themselves the burden of nursing, preserving their figures for society's gaze. The cost, the starved infants, the hollowed mothers was hidden in margins of statistics. But her life was the embodiment of that margin. Her survival tethered to obedience. Her grief swallowed into silence. It showed only in the gauntness of her face, the faint tremor in her hands as she lifted both pot and child. Above her, the house glowed with anticipation of the wedding to come. She moved through it, emptied her future already sealed in the earth behind the quarters. If her arms remembered the weight of her own child, they remembered it silently. If her body recalled the sound of its cries, the memory was drowned in the cries of others. Her body had been claimed for continuity, but not her own. Her breasts sustained children who would inherit the house, while her own child's grave inherited only silence. And in every southern household, the ledger recorded that silence. Not as grief, not as humanity, but as balance sheet. Not a diary of lives, but a record of property and transactions. For the wedding, a fresh page was opened, names written in ink. A guest list not of mourners, not of the lost, but of those deemed worthy to celebrate. The script curled elegantly across the page, each letter a claim to status, each surname a declaration of belonging. 30 households represented, bound not only by marriage, but by the shared investment in the order of things. The ledger did not end with invitations. Columns extended for gifts, silver candlesticks, bolts of imported cloth, promises of dowry land. It was proof on paper, a trail of alliances more enduring than the day's feast itself. In a culture where permanence was measured by record, the page carried more weight than the vows spoken beneath chandeliers. The handwriting announced who would be remembered, who would remain tethered to the prosperity of the family name. Conspicuously absent were the names of those who made the event possible. The enslaved appeared nowhere in the ink, even as they drove the carriages, polished the silver, and bore platters into the hall. The wet nurse who sugared the cakes did not exist on the page, nor did the stable hands who readied the horses or the seamstress who bent over the bride's gown for its final stitch. This was not oversight, it was design. To appear in the ledger was to claim presence. To be omitted was to confirm subjugation. Archival silence did not erase the work. It erased the worker. The document created a reality where the enslaved served but never existed, labored but left no trace. Future generations could read the guest list and imagine abundance without ever glimpsing the hands that laid the table. Historians combing through plantation records find the same pattern repeated endlessly. Enslaved people appear in inventory lists, Negro woman age 30 or child age 2, rarely with surnames, rarely with individuality. In moments of celebration, they vanish altogether. The same pen that carefully noted vintages of wine refused to acknowledge the people who poured them. It was not mistake but strategy. To withhold a name was to withhold personhood. To deny recognition was to secure silence. Perhaps she glimpsed the page once lying open on the master's desk. Perhaps her eyes lingered on the flourish of letters, the confident strokes of names that would endure long after the meal. Her own existence threaded invisibly between the lines, her silence underpinning every mark of ink. Whether she touched the ledger or only past it, no historian can say. What remains is absence, the deliberate omission that speaks louder than any entry. The ledger survived. Memory did not. And yet, within silence lies the flaw. The story of the wet nurse, unwritten in ink, persisted in whispers. The page declared she was not there. Soil and rumor insisted otherwise. In the South, sugar was never neutral. It was wealth imported at immense cost, extracted by the same forced labor that sustained cotton and tobacco. To heap sugar into cakes or dissolve it into wine was to display power proof that one's fortune reached across oceans. At weddings, sugar appeared in abundance tiered cakes, frosted white candied fruits glistening on silver sweetmeats pressed into the hands of guests. Each offering carried a message. Here was prosperity. Here was permanence. In the kitchen, sugar was not celebration. It was labor. The wet nurse stirred mixtures over fire-whipped eggs until her arms quivered, folded crystals into butter with hands that did not shake. The earth thickened with sweetness, layered over smoke ash and sweat. Her gaze fell on the sugar bowl, a vessel of whiteness heaped high, a symbol of cruelty, masquerading as refinement. To the family, it meant luxury. To her, it meant chains. Sugar had already claimed too much her labor, her time, her child. Through endless harvests, it had claimed countless bodies before hers. That it would now carry her act was not accident. It was fitting. Something had changed. History does not record the detail. Was a powder folded in unseen crystals slipped from a hidden pouch? The record is silent, but shadows are telling. In other accounts, poisons found their way into bread wine, sugared almonds. Some crude arsenic scraped from rat paste lie drawn from soap making. Others precise herbs steeped, dried, and ground until they passed for seasoning. Whatever her method, the sugar bowl ceased to be neutral. It became her medium. Her silence carried upward into the feast. Cakes cooled on the table, their frosted whiteness concealing more than sweetness. Candied peaches glistened under lamplight disguises, masquerading as delicacies. Guests would raise their goblets, slice their portions, lick sugared spoons, never questioning the hands that prepared them. Sweetness carried trust. It was trust she chose to break. The kitchen that day held the same contradiction as her life. The warmth of the hearth, the fragrance of baking, the promise of sweetness, all of it layered with dread. To an observer, nothing was amiss. Servants moved with practiced obedience. The overseer lingered with casual suspicion. She stirred with the same rhythm she always had. And yet, within that rhythm, lived intent. Each fold of sugar was both ordinary and final. Historians note that in the antebellum South, food was often the chosen instrument of resistance. It was accessible. It traveled undetected. It transformed a symbol of wealth into a vehicle of retribution. Newspapers, when faced with unexplained deaths, preferred to speak of spoiled meat, contaminated sugar, or tragic accidents. Rarely did they admit to design. Yet, design was there, precise as a spoonful. In the sugar bowl, sweetness was no longer sweetness. It was silence prepared to be served. They would taste joy. She would taste silence finely sweet. Knowledge moved through enslaved quarters in whispers. Not in books which were forbidden, nor in letters which could be seized, but from mouth to mouth across firelight, under cover of night. It was an unwritten pharmacopoeia roots pulled from the soil leaves steeped into teas powders, ground and hidden in cloth. To physicians, it was superstition. To the enslaved, it was survival. The wet nurse had listened for years. Women bent over the riverbank to wash clothes or gathered kindling at the edge of the woods, traded fragments of knowing a root steeped to ease childbirth, a leaf to calm a colicky child, a powder that steadied the nerves in small doses and stilled them in larger ones. No one spoke loudly. Words about plants carried danger. Overseers dismissed them until rumors of death spread. Then those same words became evidence of conspiracy. Still the knowledge endured. Guarded because it was the only thing that could be guarded. She remembered the only book available. The shape of a leaf's veins, the bitter tang of scraped bark, the sharp scent of a crushed seed. Where the family upstairs swallowed imported medicine sealed in bottles, she relied on what grew in fence lines and ditches, what the soil gave without purchase. Historians now call it vernacular medicine, but the phrase dulls its edge. In truth, it was the only medicine available. Remedies blurred into poisons, sometimes separated only by quantity. Sassafras soothed or purged, Nigella numbed or killed. West African traditions interlaced with new flora found in American soil. What emerged was a knowledge base illegible to white physicians, but precise to those who carried it. In cabins and kitchens, these remedies were tolerated when they healed the master's family infusions to bring down fever poultices to reduce swelling. Praised even. But when death struck, suddenly suspicion slipped downward. Bad air spoiled food-tainted water, these explanations were spoken. Yet beneath them lingered another fear, that the enslaved knew something unseen. It was not just labor that made them indispensable. It was knowledge. The wet nurse drew from that knowledge quietly. She had seen herbs, gathered powders wrapped in cloth seeds, hidden in hems. She did not announce her learning. She stored it silently, waiting for the moment when silence would speak more loudly than words. So when her eyes fell upon the sugar bowl, it was not a reckless act. It was a convergence. Soil, memory, and whispered instruction all forming a lineage of resistance unwritten but unbroken. History erased the recipe. No ledger carried the list of herbs, no parish record noted the dosage. But the soil remembered. Along the riverbanks, bitter leaves still grew. Roots still clung to their secrets. Seeds still bore the power to heal or to kill. She was one of the hands that knew the difference. Upstairs, the nursery was arranged as a sanctuary of comfort. Its walls papered with imported prints, its curtains falling in soft folds, its air perfumed by lavender sachets. Toys carved from ivory and polished wood lined the shelves, waiting for small hands. At the center stood a cradle gleaming, rocking gently at the slightest touch. It was there in secret that she once laid her own child. Not because it was permitted, but because no other space existed. The child lived only weeks. It fed sporadically. Weakened by hunger, its cries muted against the healthy wails of the master's infant, who fed first and fed most. The wet nurse bent over both cradles in those days, torn between the duty imposed upon her and the ache that gnawed her heart. One child was swaddled in linen, guarded as inheritance. The other wrapped in rough cloth, regarded as expendable. Both needed her milk. Only one received it. When her own baby faltered, No physician was summoned. No tincture was given. Enslaved infants rarely received formal care. Mortality was expected, counted in plantation records, the way livestock losses were tallied. Negro child deceased aged 2 months. No name attached. No stone placed. The burial came quickly. Soil covered what history would not. That same day she returned to the nursery, her breasts still full, her arms emptied. She bent again to nurse the child that was not hers. Months later, the nursery was prepared again, another infant, ready to be displayed before the wedding guests, swaddled in evidence of prosperity. She passed the doorway with her head lowered, eyes catching briefly on the cradle polished brighter than it had been the day her own child last lay there. The sight was enough. The emptiness of that cradle swinging faintly in silence carried more weight than any cry. Absence had become a presence of its own. In many households, enslaved mothers carried grief quietly. They could not mourn openly. They buried sorrow alongside their children. In the quarters, songs hummed in fragments of loss. In the house, there was only silence. For her, that silence hardened. It did not dissolve. It became fuel. Each time she passed the cradle, she remembered the child who never lived long enough to be rocked. Historians of the period write of infant mortality among the enslaved with cold detachment. Rates 2 and 3 times higher than those of white families. The causes listed malnutrition, neglect, infectious disease. The deeper cause remained absent from official records that mothers were forced to prioritize the survival of another's children over their own. Her life gave shape to what statistics conceal. Each number was a grave, each grave an absence, each absence a cradle rocking in memory, long after it ceased to hold weight. The cradle stood empty, polished, waiting for the next child of the household. It rocked slightly in the draught, as if it still held something unseen. She did not linger in the doorway. She carried on to her tasks. But the silence followed her. It echoed in her body. It sharpened her resolve. Some cradles rock forever, even when nothing lies inside. By afternoon, the estate had transformed into a theater. Carriages rattled down the gravel drive, wheels gleaming, horses brushed until their coats shone. Livery drivers reined them in before the portico, stepping down to open doors for silk-clad passengers. Guests emerged, slowly measured in their gestures, each arrival meant to be seen. Gowns swept the steps. Hoop skirts brushed the ground. Imported wool caught the sunlight buttons, glinting like small declarations of status. In the antebellum South, the procession itself was proof of prosperity. The more carriages, the deeper the wealth. The more silver-handled canes, the longer the lineage. Guests greeted one another with studied warmth names, called out, and repeated as if repetition could secure them in permanence. Inside the parlor, musicians tuned their violins, plucking strings that would soon echo beneath the chandelier's glass arms. Every detail spoke not only of marriage, but of hierarchy preserved. Beneath the surface, the hands that made the spectacle possible remained invisible. Servants circulated before the ceremony, trays of wine and sugared almonds in hand. Others opened doors, guided gowns, free from carriage steps, adjusted coats, drew chairs into place. Every gesture precise, none acknowledged. Presence counted only in function, never in recognition. The wet nurse stood at the edge of this procession, her apron clean, her eyes lowered, her role unnamed. Yet, her hands had touched every plate that would soon leave the kitchen, her work threaded invisibly through the feast. The fruit polished, the cakes arranged, the wine decanted. Guests toasted the family's abundance, never considering the labor that set each glass before them. In the records of the time, wedding descriptions lingered on visible details. Newspapers listed family names, the shade of the bride's dress, the quality of the meal. Rarely did they mention who cooked, who served, who bore the weight of silence beneath the celebration. Enslaved labor was background, an unspoken condition, like the foundation of the house or the fields stretching beyond it. The spectacle above existed because of silence below. For the enslaved, such events carried double burdens: the exhaustion of preparation and the demand for invisibility during performance. Every misstep could be noted by mistress or overseer. A spill, a stumble, even a glance held too long. Surveillance pressed down as labor continued. The wet nurse's movements were precise, her silence practiced. But beneath her calm exterior, the procession looked different. The guests were not honored figures. They were recipients of her unspoken calculation. Each carriage that arrived meant another mouth to feed. Each glass of wine another measure of her resolve. Music filled the parlor, smoothing over the sounds of servants moving swiftly at the edges of vision. Guests raised their glasses, laughter cutting the air. Wealth performed itself in every gesture. The wet nurse remained unseen. Her silence folded into the structure, her presence erased into the margins of the event. Yet, her hands had touched every plate. The dining hall glowed as if it were the center of the world. Long tables, stretched beneath a chandelier, hung with crystal drops, each prism scattering candlelight. White linen covered every surface, pressed until no crease remained. Silver utensils gleamed in ordered rows, their weight meant to remind guests of refinement. At either end of the hall, roasts were displayed, whole hams glazed in molasses. Turkeys trussed and browned, a suckling pig with an apple fixed in its mouth. Between them sat bowls of stewed vegetables, pickled okra rice, and corn puddings. Each dish heavy with labor, yet presented only as abundance. The true centerpiece was sugar. Cakes frosted in white stood on tiered stands, their surfaces adorned with candied violets and slices of orange preserved in syrup. Platters of sugared almonds and crystallized fruits encircled the table. Jewels of sweetness meant to impress. Wine gleamed in goblets, ruby red amber gold. Every detail proclaimed prosperity. But it was not prosperity evenly shared. Each dish carried the imprint of hands that would never be named. Guests entered with ceremony. Chairs scraped wood. Women arranged their skirts. Men adjusted coats. Prayers were spoken. Blessings invoked not on labor but on lineage. At the signal, servants moved, lifting platters, pouring wine hands, trained to precision voices, swallowed in silence. Conversations swelled, punctuated by laughter, by forks against porcelain, by the rising sound of a house certain of itself. From the threshold, the wet nurse stood still. She had no seat at the table, no voice in the blessings, no name in the ledger. Yet her presence was everywhere. The meats carved onto plates had passed through her hands. The cakes, frosted in whiteness, carried the sugar she had stirred. The wine, poured with flourish, had been decanted under her supervision. She needed no seat. Her reach was already in every glass and every bite. The first toast was raised, the bride's father lifting his cup higher than the rest. Glasses touched. The sound of swallowing vanished into laughter. Plates filled. Forks carried rose cake sugared almonds. Guests savored what they called richness. The room swelled with joy, mouths chewing, voices overlapping, the performance of prosperity complete. But beneath the spectacle, tension lived. Food, so often the vessel of celebration, had become in her hands something else. Silent, precise, invisible. It entered the body as trust and moved through it as betrayal. The moment of danger was indistinguishable from joy. Historians record antebellum banquets with admiration for their scale oysters, quail roasted game, puddings, candied fruits. Yet they rarely admit how fragile such feasts were. Communal dining created shared pleasure but also shared risk. One plate passed, one goblet poured. Every guest consumed the same invisible future. From the threshold, she did not move. She watched the laughter the forks raised, the goblets drained. The air glowed with food and firelight, alive with voices confident in their place. Nothing betrayed what was to come. The first bite was joy. The second, confusion. The transition from celebration to catastrophe measured only minutes. At first it was a cough, one guest lifting a silk glove to his mouth, apologizing between laughter. Then another shifted in her chair, pressing a hand to her abdomen as though steadying herself after too much wine. Harmless interruptions it seemed, but the pattern spread. Physicians of the era described poisoning symptoms: clinically sudden, cramping, excessive salivation, dizziness, then violent purging. Here the progression arrived with brutal clarity. A man bent forward at the table fork, clattering against porcelain wine, spilling across his vest. A woman's laughter broke into a gag, her hand grasping at her throat as her face drained of color. The hall filled with noise. Chairs scraped, glasses toppled, spoons clattered against dishes. The collapse moved like contagion, bodies bent, double guests staggering toward doors. Lace tore as women tried to rise, silk stained with sweat and bile. Garments designed for display reduced to soiled fabric in moments. The polished floor meant for dancing became littered with glass and food. Each shard a marker of panic. The scent shifted. What had been roasted meats and sugared cakes turned acrid vomit sweat, the metallic tang of bitten tongues. Servants trained to keep order through silence froze at the edges. Some carried pitchers of water toward the stricken. Others stood motionless, fear etched across their faces. Nothing could halt what spread through the hall. Medical knowledge of the mid-19th century faltered. Plantation physicians often blamed spoiled food, summer complaint, or miasma. The idea of deliberate poisoning was rarely admitted. To acknowledge it was to admit vulnerability. Yet in this room the evidence was undeniable. Too many bodies faltered at once. Too many voices cried out. Too much sickness erupted to be dismissed. Ceremony disintegrated. Toasts abandoned. Vows forgotten. Mothers clutched children. Men stumbled toward windows in search of air. The music cut off mid-bar. Violins fell to silence. Servants tried to contain the chaos with basins and cloths, but disorder spread faster than response. The household had prepared for every display except revolt from within. This rebellion was not of weapons, but of bodies turning violently against the very food they had trusted. From the threshold, the wet nurse did not move. She stood as the hall convulsed, her silence unchanged. Guests, their eyes blurred with tears, and sickness could not read her expression. Yet her work was everywhere in the roasts, discarded the cakes half-eaten, the goblets slipping from hands. What had been abundance became affliction. Historians might call it accident or providence. In that moment, it was something else ceremony undone, from within a feast collapsing into ruin. The lineage meant to be celebrated was brought low. Bodies sprawled across the very table meant to confirm their permanence. What began as vows ended in vomit and blood. The kitchen, as on most antebellum estates, stood apart from the main house. Built of brick or timber, separated by yard or breezeway, it contained heat smoke and fire risk, but also people. Those whose labor sustained the house were kept outside it. The division of space was architecture as hierarchy refinement above labor below. On the day of the wedding, the kitchen became more than functional. It became a barrier. When the first cries rose from the hall, chairs falling, glasses breaking, the kitchen door was drawn shut. A heavy bar slid into place, sealing the servants inside. Whether by her hand or with the quiet assent of others, the act was deliberate. The kitchen turned from a site of labor into a fortress of silence. Inside, the air was dense with smoke and cooling meats, pots still bubbling, though no one stirred them. Servants whispered in fragments, eyes fixed on the barred door. They knew the sounds above, gagging, coughing collapse. They knew suspicion would fall on them when the cries subsided. Some pressed hands together in fear. Others wept quietly. None moved to lift the bar. At the center of the stillness sat the wet nurse, her posture unhurried. She neither wept nor whispered. Her hands rested loosely in her lap. Her work was finished long before the cries began. If she heard the chaos above, she gave no sign. In a house that demanded silence, she now held it, not as submission but as defiance. The contrast between spaces was stark. Upstairs, silk tore, porcelain shattered, voices cracked in hysteria. The dining hall convulsed. Downstairs, the kitchen held its silence. The transition from celebration to catastrophe was measured in minutes. At first, only a cough, one guest covering his mouth with a silk glove apologizing between laughter. Then another shifted in her chair, pressing a hand to her abdomen as if steadying herself after too much wine. Harmless interruptions, it seemed. Yet within moments the pattern spread. Physicians of the era described poisoning symptoms, clinically sudden cramping, excessive salivation dizziness, followed by violent purging. Here the signs arrived with brutal clarity. A man bent forward at the table, his fork clattering against porcelain wine, spilling across his vest. A woman's laughter broke into a gag, her hand clawing at her throat as her face blanched. The hall filled with noise. Chairs scraped, glasses fell, spoons clattered. Collapse moved quickly, a chain reaction written across bodies dressed for display. Guests clutched at their stomachs, bent, double, or staggered toward the doors. Lace tore as women tried to rise, silk stained with sweat and bile. Garments meant to showcase status reduced to soiled fabric in minutes. The polished floor prepared for dancing became littered with broken glass and spilled food, each shard a marker of panic. The scent shifted. Roasted meats and sugared cakes gave way to the stench of vomit sweat and the metallic tang of bitten tongues. Servants trained to preserve order through silence froze at the edges. Some carried pitchers of water toward guests. Others stood motionless. Fear etched into their faces. No one could stop what spread through the hall. Medical understanding in the mid-19th century was limited. Plantation physicians often blamed spoiled food summer complaint or miasma. The idea of deliberate poisoning was rarely admitted. To acknowledge it was to acknowledge vulnerability. Yet here the evidence was undeniable. Too many bodies failed at once. Too many voices cried out. Too much sickness struck in unison to be dismissed. Panic tore apart ceremony. Toasts abandoned. Vows forgotten. Mothers clutched children. Men stumbled toward the windows for air. The music stopped mid-bar. Violins fell to silence. Servants rushed with basins and cloths, but disorder spread faster than response. The household had prepared for every performance except revolt from within. And this rebellion was not of words or weapons, but of bodies turning violently against the food they had trusted. From the threshold, the wet nurse did not move. She stood as the hall convulsed, her silence unbroken. Guests, their eyes blurred with tears, and sickness could not read her expression. Yet her work was everywhere in roasts, discarded in cakes half-eaten, in goblets slipping from hands. What had been abundance became affliction. Historians might call it accident or providence. In that moment, it was something else ceremony, undone from within a feast collapsing into ruin. The lineage meant to be celebrated was instead brought low. Bodies sprawled across the very table meant to confirm their permanence. What began as vows ended in vomit and blood. The kitchen, as on most antebellum estates, stood apart from the main house. Built of brick or rough timber, separated by a yard or breezeway, it was designed to contain heat smoke and fire risk, but also people. Those whose labor sustained the house were not welcome within it. Architecture preserved hierarchy refinement above labor below, abundance at the table, silence at its source. On the day of the wedding, the kitchen was more than functional. It was a barrier. When the first cries rose from the hall, chairs falling, glasses breaking, the kitchen door was drawn shut. A heavy bar slid into place, sealing the servants inside. Whether by her hand or by the quiet assent of others, the act was deliberate. The kitchen turned from a site of labor into a fortress of silence. Inside, the air was dense with smoke and cooling meats. Pots still bubbled faintly, though no one stirred them. Servants whispered in fragments, eyes shifting toward the barred door. They knew the sounds above: gagging, coughing, collapse. They knew too that suspicion would fall on them when the cries subsided. Some pressed hands together in fear. Others wept quietly. None moved to lift the bar. At the center of the stillness sat the wet nurse. Her posture unhurried. She neither wept nor whispered. Her hands rested loosely in her lap. Her work had been finished long before the cries began. If she heard the chaos above, she gave no sign. In a house that demanded silence, she now held it not as submission but as defiance. The contrast was stark. Upstairs, silk tore, porcelain shattered, voices cracked in hysteria. The dining hall convulsed. Downstairs, the kitchen held its silence. The ceremony dissolved in disorder. Downstairs, within the kitchen's thick walls, there was only breath, the occasional rustle of cloth, the faint hiss of cooling coals. Two worlds coexisted under one roof, one unraveling, one composed. Plantation kitchens were both central and hidden. They produced the wealth displayed in banquets, yet were built apart. Their architecture ensured that smoke and labor never intruded upon refinement. They also functioned as spaces of muted resistance, where songs, whispers, and memories could be exchanged beyond the mistress's ear. On this day, the separation became absolute. The barred door was a line of division, chaos on one side, calm on the other. To sit in calm while the house screamed was no accident. It was reclamation rare, dangerous, and deliberate. Servants had always been watched, their gestures measured by the mistress's eye or the overseer's presence. But in the locked kitchen, for a brief span, they were unseen. Invisibility, once enforced, became chosen. The wet nurse did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence filled the room more heavily than smoke or whispers. It was the silence of completion of something carried out precisely. Whatever fear spread among the others, she remained unmoved, her hands folded as if in prayer. Her gaze fixed not on the barred door but on nothing at all. While the house above screamed, she finally sat in silence. In the days that followed, silence hardened into paper. What the household had endured, convulsions at the table, sudden deaths, a celebration dissolved into hysteria, was rewritten into the language of bureaucracy. The parish ledger in a practiced hand recorded the cause as illness contracted at table. The county clerk echoed the phrasing, entering spoiled meat and tainted sugar into the official account. With a few strokes of ink, calamity became misfortune, its violence buried beneath euphemism. Such records were common. 19th century coroner reports often reduced sudden deaths to phrases so vague they could apply to almost anything: consumption fever, summer complaint. Poison, when suspected, was rarely named outright. To accuse an enslaved servant of deliberate harm was to admit vulnerability within a system built on control. To acknowledge design was to risk panic among neighboring families, each dependent on the same unseen hands. Better to blame chance to point to meat left too long in the smokehouse or sugar spoiled in damp air. The archival erasure was deliberate. Witness accounts, if given, rarely reached the page. The coughing, the retching, the panic in lace and silk, none of it survived in official form. Instead, deaths were bundled into the familiar categories of natural misfortune, as though dozens of bodies could fail at once without cause. The parish ledger's handwriting remained steady, detached, indifferent to the chaos it obscured. Historians reviewing such documents see the pattern repeated: plantation households struck by sudden illness, leaving behind only records of spoiled food, never sabotage. Archival silence was not evidence of innocence, but of protection. Protection for the reputation of the family, for the illusion of order, for the institution itself. In the ledgers, families remained untarnished, their deaths tragic but blameless. The hands that prepared their food stayed invisible, their motives unrecorded. The wet nurse's presence vanished in this process. Her labor had produced the feast. Her silence had prepared its final ingredient, yet her name, as always, was absent. No line in the coroner's report suggested her involvement. No margin noted suspicion. To acknowledge her would have been to admit that resistance remained possible even in servitude. The record could not bear such recognition. Instead, it spoke in euphemism: spoiled, tainted illness. Words that stripped away intention, reducing a calculated act to an accident of nature. The official narrative transformed rebellion into misfortune. The archive preserved not truth, but denial its pages, as silent as the graves that followed. Yet whispers endured, where ink refused. In the quarters, the story spread differently of the wedding feast turned funeral of the woman who had prepared sugar deadlier than chains. The archive named no culprit, but memory supplied one. Generations later, it was not tainted sugar that was remembered, but the woman whose silence reshaped the house forever. Researchers tracing the enslaved through archival fragments often find gaps wider than entries. A woman appears in 1 year's plantation inventory, listed as age 30, valued alongside tools and livestock, then disappears the next without explanation. Children appear as numbers under the heading increase and vanish just as quietly under decrease. Names, when granted, are fragile. Absence is constant. The wet nurse's name was always tenuous. In household records, she was little more than woman age 25 or nurse, a designation without identity. In the aftermath of the feast, even these faint traces dissolved. The next census page bore no sign of her. County records once listing her as household property omitted her entirely. No sale bill marked her transfer. No death record marked her end. She was there, and then she was not erased, not by accident, but by the same deliberate silence that covered the deaths at the feast. Enslaved women's resistance was seldom preserved in official documents. Plantation ledgers were written to maintain order, not to record defiance. To admit that a woman of the kitchen could unmake an entire lineage was unthinkable for those who wrote the records. Her absence served as protection for the family's name, erasing both her act and her existence. It also served as punishment. History itself withheld even the recognition of her life. Institutional silencing was systematic. The 1850 and 1860 federal slave schedules listed enslaved people only by age, sex, and color, never by name. Parish registers recorded the births and deaths of white children in careful script, while enslaved infants were often marked only as child or not at all. Plantation account books, when they noted illness, wrote simply Negro sick or Negro died without further detail. Against this backdrop, her disappearance from the page was no anomaly. It was the expected consequence of erasure. What remained was absence. Perhaps her body was buried behind the quarters in unmarked soil where so many others lay. Perhaps she was carried away quietly, sold under a false line in a bill of sale. The record does not say whether she lived out her years elsewhere or died soon after she ceased to exist on paper. For historians, such silence becomes a wall. The trail ends and what lies beyond is unknowable, yet absence itself speaks. The missing entry, the blank space where her name should be, the sudden gap in the census, these are as telling as any record. They confirm the lengths to which families and officials went to conceal what threatened the order. The family buried its dead in stone-marked graves. She was buried in silence. The county preserved its reputation with a phrase about tainted sugar. Her name vanished to protect the illusion of permanence. She was never freed, never buried, only vanished. Death on a plantation did not level all bodies equally. The family buried its dead in plots, carefully arranged, marked with stones, inscribed with names, dates, scripture. These cemeteries projected continuity marble imported at cost, carved into monuments tall enough to be seen from a distance. To walk among them was to walk through a curated history, each grave narrating wealth and endurance. For the enslaved, there were no such markers. Their burial grounds lay at the edges of fields or behind the quarters, hidden shallow, dug with haste, filled without ceremony. A plank of wood, a pile of stones might mark the site briefly, but weather erased them quickly. Within a generation, the ground appeared undisturbed. For their descendants, memory replaced stone as the only marker. The wet nurse was not remembered in marble. No epitaph marked her passing. Whatever branch, plank, or mound of earth once lay above her has long since vanished. The family she served rests in lined plots, their names chiseled into permanence. Hers does not. In the official landscape of memory, she was never there at all. Historians studying plantation cemeteries describe the stark contrast. White graves endure in stone and parish registers. Black graves dissolve into silence and soil. Archaeological surveys sometimes uncover long-forgotten burial grounds, bones revealed beneath farmland or construction sites. These discoveries confirm what was always known, that the enslaved were buried without permanence, their graves unmarked by choice and design. Gravestones were privileged memory enforced in stone. To deny them was to deny history itself. Yet silence was never absolute. In Black communities, oral tradition preserved what paper and stone refused. Stories of who lay where, of whose body rested, beneath which tree, carried forward in whispers. Memory became gravestone sustained by repetition rather than inscription. The story of the wedding feast traveled in this way. The family's marble monuments named the dead, but the Black families nearby remembered how they had died and by whose hand. The record erased her, but the soil and those who worked it did not. Walking through the plantation cemetery today, one sees only the stones of the family names intact. Dates preserved, inscriptions still legible. Nothing beside them reveals the other graves. The cooks, nurses, field hands, and children buried without record. Yet to stand there is to stand also above silence, above unmarked ground where her body may rest. Stone tells one story. Soil tells another. Stone forgets. Soil does not. Time passed, and the house itself changed. Paint peeled from shutters, vines climbed porch columns. The gravel drive grew over with weeds. The wedding once celebrated in ledgers and newspapers slipped from living memory into the archives. But the story of the feast, how it ended, how it was undone, did not vanish with the paper. It lingered in whispers carried not by stone or ink, but by voices. In Black communities nearby, the tale of the wet nurse survived as caution testimony and quiet vindication. Around fires, women told their daughters of the woman who had turned sugar against her masters. Men repeated her story while working the fields that once belonged to the dead. Children, hearing the fragments, dared each other to speak her name aloud, invoking a figure both feared and revered. Folklore preserved what documents refused. Denied literacy enslaved people, and their descendants sustained memory through repetition. Stories traveled across generations, not as entertainment, but as survival. To admit that a woman of the kitchen could unmake an entire lineage was unthinkable to those who wrote the records. Her absence served as protection for the family's name, erasing both her act and her existence. It also served as punishment. History itself withheld even the recognition of her life. Institutional silencing was systematic. The federal slave schedules of 1850 and 1860 listed enslaved people only by age, sex, and color, never by name. Parish registers recorded the births and deaths of white children in careful script, while enslaved infants were often noted only as child or not at all. Plantation account books, when they mentioned illness, recorded simply Negro sick or Negro died. Against this backdrop, her disappearance from the page was no anomaly. It was the expected consequence of erasure. What remained was absence. Perhaps her body was buried behind the quarters in unmarked soil where so many others lay. Perhaps she was carried away quietly, sold under a false line in a bill of sale. The record does not say whether she lived out her years elsewhere or died soon after she ceased to exist on paper. For historians, such silence becomes a wall. The trail ends and what lies beyond is unknowable, yet absence itself speaks. The missing entry, the blank space where her name should be the sudden gap in the census, these are as telling as any record. They confirm the lengths to which families and officials went to conceal what threatened their order. The family buried its dead in stone-marked graves. She was buried in silence. The county preserved its reputation with a phrase about tainted sugar. Her name vanished to protect the illusion of permanence. She was never freed, never buried, only vanished. Death on a plantation did not level all bodies equally. The family buried its dead in carefully arranged plot stones inscribed with names, dates, scripture. These cemeteries were places of permanence meant to project continuity. Each marker proof that the lineage endured, each inscription a claim against forgetting. Marble was imported at great cost, carved into monuments tall enough to be seen from a distance. To walk among them was to walk through a curated history, each grave narrating both wealth and endurance. For the enslaved, there were no such markers. Their burial grounds lay at the edges of fields or behind the quarters, hidden under trees or in low ground the family had no use for. Graves were shallow, dug with haste, filled without ceremony. A plank of wood or a pile of stones might serve as a marker, but weather erased them quickly. Within a generation, the ground appeared undisturbed. For their descendants, memory replaced stone as the only marker. The wet nurse was not remembered in marble. No stone bears her name. No epitaph marks her passing. Whatever lay above her branch, plank or mound of earth has long since vanished. The family she served rests in lined plots, their names chiseled into permanence. Hers does not. In the official landscape of memory, she was never there at all. Historians studying plantation cemeteries describe the stark contrast. White graves endure in stone and parish registers. Black graves dissolve into silence and soil. Archaeological surveys sometimes uncover long-forgotten burial grounds, bones revealed beneath farmland or construction sites. These discoveries confirm what was always known, that the enslaved were buried without permanence, their graves unmarked by choice and design. Gravestones were privileged memory enforced in stone. To deny them was to deny history itself. Yet, silence was never absolute. In black communities, oral tradition preserved what paper and stone refused: stories of who lay where, of whose body rested beneath which tree, carried forward in whispers. Memory became gravestone, sustained by repetition rather than inscription. The story of the wedding feast traveled in this way. The family's marble monuments named the dead, but the black families nearby remembered how they had died and by whose hand. The record erased her, but the soil and those who worked it did not. Walking through the plantation cemetery today, one sees only the stones of the family names, intact dates, preserved inscriptions still legible. Nothing beside them reveals the other graves, those that held the bodies of cooks, nurses' field hands, and children. Yet to stand there is to stand also above silence, above unmarked ground where her body may rest. Stone tells one story, soil tells another. Stone forgets, soil does not. Time passed, and the house itself changed. Paint peeled from shutters, vines crawled up the porch columns. The gravel drive grew over with weeds. The wedding, once celebrated in ledgers and newspapers, slipped from living memory into the archives. But the story of the feast, how it ended, how it was undone, did not vanish with the paper. It lingered in whispers, carried not by stone or ink, but by voices. In black communities nearby, the tale of the wet nurse survived as caution testimony and quiet vindication. Around fires, women told their daughters of the woman who had turned sugar against her masters. Men repeated her story while working the fields that once belonged to the dead. Children, hearing fragments, dared each other to speak her name aloud, invoking a figure both feared and revered. Folklore preserved what documents refused, denied literacy enslaved people, and their descendants sustained memory through repetition. Stories traveled across generations, not as entertainment, but as survival. They named the unnamed, preserved, the acts erased from ledgers, and carried forward the possibility that resistance had existed even when the archive denied it. Each retelling of the wedding feast marked a refusal of silence. Historians studying oral history note how such accounts blend detail and omission. Names fade, dates shift, but the core remains. In this case, the record omitted her entirely. Yet, the oral account insisted there was a woman. She worked in the kitchen, and she ended the feast with silence of her own. Where the ledger wrote tainted sugar voices corrected the lie, saying instead, she made it so. The story carried both fear and pride. For some, it warned that those who served held power even in invisibility, that one act could undo an entire household. For others, it offered dignity, that in a world designed to erase one woman, left a mark silence could not conceal. In either form, it was remembered, repeated, reshaped to suit the needs of those who carried it. Generations later, children dared one another to whisper her name outside the ruins of the house. They said the dining hall was haunted not by spirits, but by memory. The kind that seeps into walls and lingers at tables long after guests are gone. No stone bore her record, but the land itself carried the weight of what had been done. The family's descendants, when asked, often denied the tale, pointing instead to the official record of illness. But denial only confirmed the gap between archive and memory. What white stone preserved in permanence, black voices corrected in whispers. The two histories never reconciled. The past may be buried, but it keeps speaking at the table. In the end, what remains is absence. Her name appears in no census, no plantation inventory after the year of the wedding, no obituary, no line of scripture carved in stone. The graves on the hill preserve the lineage of the family she served. Each marker etched with dates, verses and names carried forward. Her resting place lies unmarked if it was recorded at all. Somewhere in the soil behind the quarters, erased by design. Institutional silence was the final weapon of control. To name her would have been to admit that power was not absolute, that even within the kitchen, an enslaved woman could alter the course of a household forever by omitting her the record claimed order. It presented tragedy as accident collapse as misfortune. Paper hardened into authority, turning her act into something it was never meant to be, a footnote of tainted sugar, a line stripped of human agency. But silence is never complete. Whispers carried her further than ink ever could. Across generations, in the voices of those who remembered, she became more than a missing name. She became an answer to the cruelty that had stolen her child. A figure whose silence at the threshold was louder than the screams upstairs. The archive attempted to erase her. Memory refused. In that refusal lay her permanence. Folklore preserved her in fragments. A wedding where laughter ended in coughing. Sugared cakes that turned bitter in the mouth. A warning passed from mother to child of the woman who had taken back what was denied. Historians may find no document to confirm her. But the survival of her story in oral tradition is itself a record, a ledger written not in ink but in repetition. Her absence is not void, but presence of another kind. Every missing name on a census, every blank in a ledger, every Negro woman, noted without detail, carries the possibility of her. The system that erased her also ensured her story would endure outside its control. What the parish refused to write the soil, and those who worked it did not forget. The house where she labored no longer stands. Its windows are broken, its walls collapsed. The graves on the hill still bear their marble, weathered but legible. Yet the truest monument to her is neither stone nor record. It is the silence she chose when she barred the kitchen door and folded her hands as the house above convulsed. That silence has outlived the ledgers. Her name unrecorded, her grave unknown. Her body vanished from history, but her act survives. The single defiance that turned a celebration into a funeral. The moment when sugar ceased to be sweetness and became judgment. If milk could be stolen, then so could life. The archive wrote only tainted sugar and spoiled meat. But memory wrote something else. It wrote her. The family she served rests in marble, their lineage carved into permanence. She rests in soil unmarked, unacknowledged. Yet, her silence still unsettles. A defiance history could not erase. Because in the end, her truth was not written in ledgers, but in the bodies that fell at the table. Her final word remains, if milk could be stolen, then so could life. If this story has unsettled you, remember, there are many more histories hidden in silence. Subscribe to the Seventh Mark. Tap the bell so you never miss when we unearth the forgotten. And share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? Because history may try to bury its dead, but here we dig them back up.